Hello everyone, Exifer here. I recently ran a poll on my channel where I asked you where you thought these non-human intelligences might originate from. There were votes for each option, but a large amount of you voted for higher or parallel dimensions as your choice. So, I've decided to make this video as a sort of public safety announcement. If these things are interdimensional, I want you to be prepared and fully aware of the dangers you may face. To start, let's go over the dimensions we're used to. In 0 dimensions, all you have is a point. When you add a dimension, you can have a line. In 2 dimensions, you can have a square. And in 3 dimensions, our dimension, you can have a cube. If we were to go up one more dimension, to 4D, we could have what is called a tesseract. We as 3D beings can't imagine a tesseract, but we can predict that its 3-dimensional shadow would look like this. All life as we know it lives in the 3rd dimension, which allows for solid matter to exist, and we have never discovered a form of life with less than 3 dimensions. Life would be extremely difficult for a 2D being. Not only could you only see lines, if you could see at all, but you would be unable to have a mouth and an anus without splitting apart. While this may not seem like good news for the interdimensional origin idea, it doesn't rule it out, as it may be the case that life requires a minimum of 3 dimensions to exist, and dimensions higher than ours are full of life. So, what would it be like to interact with a being from a dimension higher than ours? Like with the tesseract, it's hard to imagine, but there are certain things we can predict. It helps to scale everything down a dimension when doing so. Then we can observe how I, as a 3D being, standing in for a 4D being, interact with this 2D being, standing in for a 3D being, that I have designed for this explanation. As you can see, it has all the necessary organs and no anus, for I am a merciful creator. So, this 2D being is going about its day, chilling out in its 2D house, when suddenly I, a higher dimensional being, spot it and decide to make contact. Hello, I say. Lovely day, isn't it? As I say this, my sound waves hit its dimension, and from its perspective, my words seem to come from everywhere at once. It begins to panic, unsure of what is happening. It wonders if it has gone insane. You lean in closer to try and speak to it more directly, and whisper so it doesn't get scared. Your sound waves hit the being's insides, and now it thinks there's a whispering voice coming from inside it. It truly has gone insane. You lean back. This is going to be harder than you thought. So, why did that happen? If we look at this 2D being, as 3D beings, we notice that we can see all of its insides and outsides at the same time. Nothing is hidden from us. This means we have access to every aspect of this creature's biology and can manipulate and communicate with it in ways that seem like magic. Scale it up so we are 4D beings talking to a human, and the human would perceive it as the omnipresent voice of God, or a voice coming from inside their own head. It's enough to start a religion about, but we aren't trying to be worshipped. We just want to make conversation. So we decide it's time to enter the lower dimension and try a more personal meeting with the being. Now, there are 2 possibilities when imagining a 2D dimension. In one, the dimension exists as a non-solid plane that can be passed through by 3D objects. This means that if I were to pass a ball through the plane, the 2D beings would perceive a point appear out of nowhere, which would grow in size as the ball entered, and then shrink as it left, before vanishing completely. If we scale this up again, it means that we would perceive a 4D hypersphere as a sphere that appears out of nowhere, grows, then shrinks, then vanishes as it passes through our 3D plane. In the other possibility, the dimension exists on the surface of a 3D object, meaning that higher dimensional beings couldn't pass through it, but could still touch and interact with it. In this scenario, I, as a 3D being, am limited to my fingertips and footprints if I want to be seen. This is a problem, as there is no way a 2D being will ever understand my true shape if I'm limited to my fingers and feet. You tap your fingers in frustration, and the 2D being starts to panic again. As far as it's concerned, multiple separate entities have just entered its dimension and disappeared. From its perspective, each of your fingertips were disconnected from each other completely because the hand they were attached to wasn't in its dimension. If we scale this up once more, we are reminded of the ancient pantheons of gods where many are claimed to be different avatars of the same higher being. Indeed, what we in the third dimension perceive as separate entities across the world could be merely the fingertips of some higher dimensional hand that we may never understand. I'm getting annoyed now. All I wanted to do was have a chat with this little creature, but it keeps panicking. If I want it to understand, I'm going to have to show it how I see the world. So, I take my higher dimensional hand, and I pick up the 2D being into the third dimension. There, I say. Do you see now? The being immediately screams in pain. It has never travelled up or down before, as that was impossible in 2 dimensions. This means that its body has never felt the effects of gravity and has evolved in such a way that it lacks what we would consider a top and bottom side. By bringing it up into the third dimension, we've effectively put a hole right through it. And even though gravity is technically weaker in the higher dimensions, it affects the being in ways its body wasn't designed for. The organs are pulled by gravity through the hole and are left hanging outside the body, exposed to the elements of the higher dimension. So, let's scale this up. If a 4D being were to lift a 3D human into a higher spatial dimension, our bodies would suddenly have a hole going right through them from lacking a 4D side, and our internal organs, and anything not tightly secured, would be hanging out, struggling to function in this new direction. Now it's our turn to panic, as we don't want to hurt this being, so we quickly put it back in its own dimension. The being writhes around in pain for a few seconds before stopping. It's dead. What happened? We weren't careful enough when putting it back. Its organs have been stretched out by exposure to our dimension. So when we put it back, some of them accidentally overlapped with its outsides. As we know, things have no thickness in 2D. There is no up or down. Unfortunately for our 2D friend, this means things can't overlap. Any organs still outside its body were severed at the atomic level, cut by space itself, or rather, the lack of it. Scaling it up, we can determine that, like rising from a deep scuba diving session, it's better to transition slowly, unless you want a painful death. Humans typically need their insides on the, inside. As you can see, interaction with higher dimensional beings would be a potentially dangerous event, possibly resulting in religion or death. So you should all take great care moving forward. It should be noted that this is all under the assumption that matter can exist in higher dimensions, as some scientists believe that the new direction of movement would weaken the links between particles and atoms, resulting in matter disintegrating entirely. There are also scientists that believe things wouldn't disintegrate, but would become altered in ways we aren't used to. For example, it has been predicted that in 4D, light would stretch into incredibly long beams, a loud bang would become like rolling thunder, and the metal magnesium would become a noble gas. Planetary orbits would be unstable, if not impossible. This means that if there are higher dimensional beings, they are far more exotic than anything we could imagine, being so unlike us that we likely wouldn't even recognize them as a form of life until they started trying to communicate with us. But when they do, maybe think twice about accepting their offer. And whatever you do, don't panic. Thanks for watching.